Well, hello everyone, and welcome back. This is episode 2, and I'll be covering the impacts of colonisation. The very first video I ever did was about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures as two separate distinct cultures. This video is going to go into a little bit about the impacts of colonisation on both the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and the intergenerational trauma and the negative learnt behaviour that has existed as a result of colonisation. So when Captain Cook and his merry men first came here, obviously there was a bit of fear around the traditional owners, the traditional custodians, the natives as they called us, on this land that they labelled as being uninhabited, and whatever that word is, that we didn't have a mob living here before colonisation. So we all learned that was a myth. We all know the history, the true history, that there was always my people living here and in the Torres Straits for thousands of years and for generations. So the impacts on our culture was great. There was a loss of identity, a loss of family, a loss of community, a loss of culture, a loss of cultural protocols, a loss of language, which is very important to us. And we were to be assimilated into what we now know as, the English model or the European model of how we exist. So welcome to this second episode of Two Eyes Seeing, where we're going to see things through a black lens and a white lens, and hopefully we'll learn something about these conversations. So when the settlers first came and the convicts came and the government and the Crown made the decision, everything changed for everybody, especially for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They came in, our people were massacred, they were abused, they were raped, they were beaten, they were taken in as slaves, used to clear land, used as houseboys, used as housemaids, and obviously the soldiers, the convicts that were released later on, and the public in general. There were populations of those communities that took advantage of our people and our women and children, and there was a lot of abuse and sexual violence that occurred. There were massacres that occurred, and they tried everything. There were bounties on Aboriginal people that they would get rewards, and same as the Torres Strait Islander people, they were getting rewards for the amount of Aboriginal people that they killed. And that's all based on fear and ignorance and racism, that they came to this new land but didn't like my people, were afraid of my people, didn't take the time to learn our ways and our culture, because you've got to remember that people coming to our shores wasn't a new thing. Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander people have been trading with other nations for generations. The northern parts of Australia, we've always traded with the Asians, the Macassans, the Indonesians and so on for generations. The Torres Strait, the Papua New Guineans and other Pacific Islanders, the South Sea Islanders, for generations. So people coming to our shores wasn't a new thing for our people around Australia. But there was that fear. And so we were massacred in large numbers. Our land was taken away from us. We were dispossessed. We were taken away. We were isolated. We were put in missions and reserves. And of course, in another video, I'll talk a little bit more about the stolen generations. So with colonisation brought laws and rules and regulations. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were segregated, we were taken away, we were removed from our homelands, our traditional homelands that had been our homelands for generations, and taken onto outstations, missions, reserves, in the hope that the population would die out and then they didn't have to deal with our people anymore. But we all know that wasn't the case and that we've continued to thrive and survive. So they brought these laws in, they removed our people. Those that they didn't massacre were driven off their land and taken into these government or the Crown at the time, and the government appointed establishments in the hope of educating us, of teaching us, of making us stop our cultural practices, speaking our language, and so on. So the impacts were great, and we're still feeling it now. In contemporary society, we're still feeling the impacts of colonisation. So during that process, we lost our connection, but it wasn't completely lost, but we lost our connection to land, country, each other, our families, our communities. We couldn't practice our law or anything like that anymore. So on these communities and stations, and over time, governments and successive governments over the years have introduced all these laws to govern and control, monitor, audit and review Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and still continues in government today. So what happened was we were taken away to these missions reserves. These missions and reserves had government officials, mission managers, government authorities that managed and controlled Aboriginal people. We weren't allowed to leave those missions and reserves. We were segregated from the rest of the population. We weren't allowed the same privileges as the white population and the broader population, and we were just isolated. Now, back in 2020 when COVID happened, a lot of my people and myself included, we thought about that and thought, well, now the general population in Australia can have a little taste of what happened to Aboriginal people. We were segregated, we were isolated, we had to have permits and permission to go anywhere, just like what happened in the shutdown during COVID. So for a small amount of time, the broader Australian community experienced what Aboriginal people have experienced for generations: being removed, being isolated, having no permission to go anywhere, not being allowed or permitted to go anywhere. My parents, grandparents and others had, and we're not talking about 100 years ago, we're talking in my generation as well, where they had these permits or licenses, or dog tags as we call it, that if the bully man or police pulled over my dad or my parents or whoever of that generation, they had their permits from the government to say that they were allowed in the city or wherever they were allowed off the mission and reserves. So that was the segregation, and that was the control they had for generations of my people. So then they were bringing all these racist laws of what we can and can't do. Some people have the argument of saying, oh, do you believe, Aboriginal people don't need to stay on these reserves and missions anymore. They can live wherever they want. People don't understand that. For some, that's all they've only ever known that mission. They've only ever known that reserve or community. They still have ties. They've gone back. They've reconnected. They have ties with their traditional homelands. But a lot that were on those missions reserves stayed because where are they going to go? They don't have the finances. They don't have the money. They don't have the resources. They don't have the support. Some of them, not all, but some lost their connection to country. They didn't know where their family came from because they were in Christian missions. And they lost all their connection to land and country. It's only later on in life that they reconnected with relatives, family, that knew the family, knew their history, told them where they were from, and they were able to have those connections again. And yes, there were populations of people that did go back to the country, but there was also a population that they haven't, because the mission and reserves is all they know. It doesn't mean that they don't practice culture or that they don't know culture. They continue to practice culture. But those laws came in and permitted and put boundaries around everything: hunting, gathering, where they could go, where they could be, where they were permitted, because the government controlled everything. So we were treated like cattle and sheep, where we were rounded up, we were put in these missions and reserves, and we weren't allowed to leave unless the government said we were allowed to. So fast forward, and there are other laws that came in. We will go into another episode later on about the stolen generations, But the other thing that they brought in were actual laws. Now, the very first law in Queensland, again, for Aboriginal people was the Chinese brought, during the Gold Rush days and other times over the years, the Chinese and other Asian communities and other communities brought in things like opium. So one of the very first early laws that Queensland introduced was forbidding the sale of opium to Aboriginal people, that it was against the law for people and individuals to sell opium. So it's okay to have opium, and the women walking around with these little pill boxes and have opium in them and do whatever they need to do, but it was against the law for them to sell to Aboriginal people. Some will argue that, well, that's a good thing, and others will argue, well, it was about freedom of choice. So there have been progressive laws over the years. Of course, we didn't have any laws until Uncle Eddie Koiki Mabo and other plaintiffs who put in and took Queensland government to court and won, and we know that as the native title, and Aboriginal people then started the process of having, once again, land rights. And of course, over the years, governments, both state and federal, tried to water down those laws in the light of being fair for the broader community, etc. So we didn't have access to our land. We were taken away from our land. We were taken away from our connections. Our land is like our family. It is our mother. It is our creator. It is our bloodline. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, and we were cut off from that. So those laws came in. Of course, there were discriminative laws where Aboriginal Torres Strait people weren't allowed into establishments like pubs and buildings and so on. We saw it during the war, and we'll go into more detail in another video about that Aboriginal Torres Strait people have proudly served in every conflict that this country has ever been in, from the Boer War till modern day conflicts and peacekeeping exercises. So our people weren't permitted. We weren't citizens until 1967. Discriminative laws came in where there was segregation. They weren't allowed into certain areas, establishments, participate in all that sort of stuff. Queensland government even had a law at one stage, and they've regurgitated those laws with controlling the motorcycle clubs or gangs, or that they perceive as being good gangs. And those laws in Queensland were 3 or more Aboriginal people weren't allowed to congregate together. So there's no way that my father, who comes from a very large family, or my mother, where they could get together and go somewhere as a group, because the police will be called. What's the disturbance? Why are you all here? Why are you together? So that's just an example of some of the ridiculous and racist and ignorant laws that were introduced into our communities, which isn't taught in history. It's taught amongst the black population because we've lived it, we're part of it, we teach our children about it, not to go back in time and wish we were there again or be stuck in that space. It's just simply to educate our next generation of what can't happen ever again, that we cannot do this ever again to people, regardless of their background. So there was segregation, there was ignorance and racism, and to be fair, there were also, as we fast forward, that also applied to, there were similar type of laws that were applied to women as well. And I'm not just talking about black women, I'm talking about women in general, that there were rules and laws around when women got married, they had to resign from their jobs. They now had to be, these domestic goddesses at home and look after their family and look after their man and all that sort of rubbish. As soon as they got pregnant, many women were asked to leave because we can't have a pregnant woman, in the workplace. It's going to cost us a lot more, whatever reason that they did it. So there have been laws that have impacted, people in different times of history, different backgrounds, different race, different genders, etc. And so, obviously today I'm focusing on Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. So we couldn't get bank loans. We couldn't do other things that normal people had. So what the government introduced, and I remember as a kid, and this went on till I was even older, where the government introduced various agencies and departments. And so there was the DAA, as we call it, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. Anyone that was living in an urban city or town and not on a mission reserve, they had to provide housing. So we were under DAA. So the Department of Aboriginal Affairs provided government housing for Aboriginal Torres Strait people. We still had to pay rent. We still had to pay all, everything else that comes with living in a city and in a town. And so my parents had to always go down and make sure that the rent was paid. I asked my mum once why we had to do. My mum was a hard worker all her life, and she was a cleaner like a lot of the women. They were nurses, cleaners, worked in factories and whatever. The men were out cutting cane, working on the railways, doing anything they could, hard labour, to actually provide food for the family, which is what my father did. My father would always say, we've got the rent, we're going to make sure we pay it on time. Now, part of that segregation and part of those laws was they would also come around. And I asked my mum one time, why do we have to tidy this house and keep it spotless every day? Why is Dad always out there cutting the grass and trimming the hedges and bushes and weeding, whatever? And Mum said, no, it's because them mob are going to come around, the government and white fellas are going to come around and check our house and make sure that we're doing the right thing, that we're caring for the house. And I said to Mum, well, what are they going to do? They said, well, we can get into trouble, we could lose the house, we could be taken back to wherever they want to take us to, move us. There'll be fines, we could go to jail. There's all this negative stuff that was the result. So our house was spotless, when we were growing up. Like spring cleaning wasn't spring cleaning. Our spring cleaning was every day and every weekend because of those rules and regulations. Now, up in Wyburn or Thursday Island, my parents owned a fish and chip shop, and it's still there today. And my mum said that my father was spotless. He had white shirt, white pants, white aprons, and he made sure his work uniform, his aprons, everything was spotless, and that the kitchen was spotless. The counters and the benches were spotless. And when I asked my mum why, they said, well, because the governments can come in, and because it was a black fella running the business, they would check everything, check the cleanliness, check everything, and if there was anything out of place, they would shut the business down. So there was that level of fear that people have lived in. Because it was like, well, yeah, we'll allow you and give you a permit to have a fish and chip shop, but you better make sure you play by the rules. And fast forward, I've been in shops where I've walked in and walked straight out, whether they little fish and chip shops or whatever, thinking, man, there's no way in hell I'm going to be eating food out of that place. But yet, Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people who had their own businesses were audited, were reviewed, were monitored constantly. So there was all these sort of laws that happened where we weren't allowed into establishments. Those that served in the military, sadly, when they came back home, although they went and served their country, many in the early conflicts weren't even citizens yet, but they stood up, they enlisted, they went and fought for our country. But when they came home, they realised that things hadn't changed. They weren't allowed into the RSLs. They weren't allowed to march with their comrades. People even asked them if the medals that they were wearing were real, that if they actually served, then the uniform that they were wearing or the medals or whatever it was, if it was for real and if they did actually serve, and they did. So early on, giving the RSLs and the military a bit of credit here, is that they were the ones that pushed governments, both local and state, and federal, to start re-looking at these laws, because these men sacrificed like everybody else. And even the white soldiers couldn't understand, well, he was in the trenches with me, but yet, he can't come in and have a beer with me. I've got to bring out some drinks in a plastic cup and some, curried egg sandwiches, egg and lettuce sandwiches, and sit in the gutter with my mate and have something to eat after the parade. So this is the type of laws that were in place. I know of people where they couldn't get bank loans, so they went to loan sharks, and you can, of course, imagine what that was like. Paying 20-30% on a loan. If you missed the payment, they'd send the boys around. So it wasn't, any leeway there. There was no flexibility there. It was, you owe us the money, simply because they couldn't get loans, but yet they were working. They could afford it, but the banks and establishments they weren't allowed. Now, we also have to remember that over the years, all these laws that were introduced have never been overturned or changed. They've just laid dormant. So, it's easy for government, and I guess this is the fear of Aboriginal Torres Strait people, is that there's a fear that they can regurgitate these laws and implement them just like they did with COVID. Like, there was no legal, I guess, if you're going to go down the white man way of living, there was no precedent for what they did, what the government did during our lockdowns. But they just, out of fear, said, yeah, we're going to do this. And, we see in history now that Australia was the most locked down, monitored, legislated countries in the world during COVID, especially in places like Victoria and so on. So they actually introduced these laws. Now, one of the other things that colonisation brought was our people had to work in building this country. And then they opened it up to immigrants, saying, oh, welcome, welcome, welcome. But the immigrants were brought in to actually build this country as well. So my fathers and uncles and aunties and my mother and so on worked alongside immigrants to build this nation, working in the cane fields, working on the railways, working as concreters and builders to build infrastructure for governments. And that continues today. The other one thing the colonisation and laws brought in is that they have what we call blackbirding. Now, people look at America and they point the finger at America about the slave trade and all that. We had our own here. We used our local Aboriginal Torres Strait people as slaves with very little pay or no pay at all. Then they had blackbirding. Now, what blackbirding is, it's the Queensland government went across to the South Sea Islands, lured, kidnapped, brought back South Sea Islanders to work in the cane fields and the railways and so on. And the generations, their inheritance still lives here. So I have family who are married into South Sea Islander culture, and they're like the third, if you like, Indigenous culture in this country. And so there's a legacy there that, the people don't want to know about in history, that we had our own slave trade. Now, that process was so successful that the Western Australian government at the time thought that was a great idea. So they started to lure, kidnap, remove Aboriginal people from their communities to work in industries like the pearling industry and other industries in Western Australia, because it worked so well in Queensland. So this type of things is what brought colonisation. And then we have disease, we have everything else that was brought, to the point that our rivers, our sacred water holes, the places where we drank from and that we used were poisoned to kill off our people. Now, we never had the influenza, we didn't have COVID, we didn't have any of that sort of stuff. But once it was introduced, like it was in Europe, like the Black Plague, it just went through. And you can imagine our people, we've never had that sort of stuff before. These infections, these viruses and so on. So colonisation brought all that. And people wonder why, but how can we still have disadvantage we have really bad physical, mental and social health issues in Aboriginal communities? Because our people, we still have our genetics, our heritage, our bloodlines, and our people weren't ready for that sort of stuff. Even now, we don't cope with that sort of thing. and governments have done very little to actually help Aboriginal people, as in medicines and so on. And I'm always confused because you can go to an outback town and the local pub, there'll only be one street, one pub, one post office, and that the pub has beer. So they get supplied alcohol, but yet the outback and remote areas and traditional areas and communities don't have any access to medication. There's no medication that they can get to help them. So, we're living in the 21st century. We're not living back in the day. So, all these laws, Aboriginal people have to fight to get rights to healthcare, education, to employment, housing, all this sort of stuff. We've had to fight when it should be our right, because, well, in 1967, our people became citizens. So why don't we have a house, or why don't we have access to banks like everyone else? Why is it that we're on paper we're considered citizens and included on the census, but yet we still weren't entitled to receive a lot of things? So the trauma that comes with that is that intergenerational trauma, that the fear still continues for the next generation because they've experienced it. They've experienced and they've heard the stories from their grandparents, their parents, their older siblings, and that fear sets in. And that we're always questioned in our own country of why we're here, where we're from, what are we doing? And so that was one of the impacts that colonisation brought, is it brought in ignorant, discriminative laws, and we've seen that all around the world with Indigenous cultures. The segregation, the isolation, the removal, the laws that prevented us from going into cities and so on. Even now, and I'd ask you to go and do your research in the local city or towns that you live in, and you can guarantee there's a boundary road in your city or in your town, not just in the major cities like Sydney and Brisbane and so on, that they're in smaller towns, here, not far from us, we on these coastal towns here have them. So the boundary road, what boundary road is that was the street or the road where blackfellas couldn't cross. That was the boundary. And it still exists. Boundary roads still exist in these places. And they're triggering for Aboriginal people. Like people wonder, what are you so nervous about, and what's the issue around Boundary Road? And when you tell them the history, they're like, oh my God. I say, yeah, those signs, those street names have never been removed. So, I encourage you to do your research and look at the laws and even go to Google and other things like that and chat, what they call ChatGPT or whatever it is, and put in what are the discriminative laws that were placed on Aboriginal Torres Strait people, and you'll see all the laws that came in to control Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that's why, like I said in the very first episode, is that we started our own healthcare. We started everything because no one was going to help us. And now we have Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander doctors, specialists, healthcare workers, and so on, that contribute to our people and help our people because it was never ever provided for us. Now, also come with colonisation is we go into this discussion about the health and well-being and nutrition of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. A lot of people say, well, why is the nutrition bad? Why is the diet so bad in communities? Now, that's because when they created these missions and reserves and took us away, the government thought, well, we can't just let these people starve. We'll have to provide something. So they gave us rations. They gave us flour, tea, sugar, all the basics. No fresh vegetables, all just canned foods, no fresh vegetables, hamper, corned beef, So most of the stuff that Aboriginal people ate is stuff that people would do probably once a year, if that, when they go camping. And it's a novelty. Oh, let's make a Aussie damper. Let's make this and this and this. Our people had no choice. So there was a generation where me and my siblings, ate the foods, and my generation ate the foods that our parents made. Dampers, Johnny cakes, domboys or stews. making stews out of corned beef, doing the best that we could, because we weren't allowed to, and they were rationed. They were rationed out to families and communities. So that learned behaviour continued. So we have a generation of people that, well, they still eat those foods. They still, go out and eat like everybody else. But those main ingredients, if you like, that were rationed out are still part. I spent, like I said, 35 years in the public service, 25 of that down in Canberra. And I remember my nephew was visiting and came into my house, and I had a couple of tins of hamper corned beef, and I could hear him and my other nephew laughing. And I thought, what did you laughing about there? And I said, look, Uncle, how long have you been down here? I said, I don't know, 20 years or whatever. And they said, and you work for government? And I said, yeah. He goes, and you still got a couple of tins of hamper corned beef, tin meat in your cupboard? I said, mate, I have to have my tin meat there. And it's that learnt behaviour. And before you knock it, mate, ask any black fella, we can make some deadly stews out of tin meat. You got tin meat, potatoes, vegetables, soy sauce, whatever, and we'll smash it for you. You'll see black fellas on MasterChef cooking that stuff. So we made do with what we had, and that's what the health issues are, is that we weren't given nutrition, we weren't given access to healthcare, and now we're trying to fix the problem, and the governments don't know how. And we'll go into another video on how governments can improve that when we talk about our engagement with Aboriginal Torres Strait people and including us in these decision-making processes and changing these discriminative laws and practices where we do have the freedoms. And mind you, that happens in the broader community today. So we have low socioeconomic communities in our cities and in our towns and around our communities that have low income and so on, and their kids are living off McDonald's and KFC. I don't know how they can afford it these days, but so there's that intergenerational behaviours, there's negative learnt behaviours, and that trauma that comes with a lot of these low economic, I don't know what the word is, all them poor communities. And so there's a trend here. There's, when we if we can keep people controlled, if we can keep them unhealthy, lazy, whatever, we can control them. And so that's what colonisation brought. It brought famine, disease, heartbreak, disengagement, loss, the loss of identity, the loss of family, the loss of community, and even trying to go down to another level of destroying our spirit. And we now know that our resilience, our survival comes from our inner strength, our spirit, our connection to land, country, and our ancestors who guided us, who helped us, who've been through this sort of stuff and come to us. They visit us, whether it be in our dreams or whether we see them in messages and signs and all this sort of stuff to help us. And we still have those connections. We still, my father passed back in 2000. I still talk to him every day. I have older brothers and sisters that passed away as babies, as youngsters. I talk to them every day. And so they're my guides, they're my teachers, they're my everything. They're my protectors. And they do that for my children. They do that for my partner. They do that for our communities. And so that's what colonisation brought. It brought destruction, but it hasn't survived, and we're now rebuilding. So I'm asking you again, like I did in the first video, do your research. Don't just take my word for it. Don't believe anything I'm saying. Do your research about the laws, the impacts. And this is when we talk about truth-telling that Aboriginal people want, and we want this to be taught in schools and not to gloss over it. And it's not the blame game or to point the finger. It is understanding history and what happened actually is going to benefit the next generation, whether they be black or white, because they'll realise how bad that is. We can make the comparison of the life they have now compared to the life that others had and how we were treated. And that you can guarantee they will soon like, oh my God, we did not know. And their views, and when they become teenagers and then young adults, they will have a different view on society. And we will be more united because we have a better understanding of each other and our history. And now we understand why. So when a young black man jumps on the bus in the city, he's got no money on his ticket, and it beeps, and the bus driver says, get off the bus. And that kid explodes. He goes to town, you're a racist prick, you're rah, 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 rah. Now, that didn't just happen then. That was a build-up of generations and generations of ignorance, racism, segregation, etc. And that was just the tip of the iceberg for this young man. And the only place we can go is fight or flight. And so we go to what we understand, is that they treated my grandmother like this, my great-grandmother, my grandmother and grandfather, my parents, my older siblings, whatever, and now they're doing it to me. And sadly, at the end of it, there was also the driver who was like, well, you just didn't have any money on your ticket, so I can't let you on. But of course, mate, common sense says, mate, just let him on. A couple of bucks ain't going to ruin your day if you do a kind thing and let a kid on. So that's the intergenerational trauma that comes with is part of the impacts of colonisation. Ill health, unemployment, lack of housing, and so on. So do your research. I hope this makes sense to you and you got something out of this short little video. And please, if anyone asks for help, if everyone needs something, don't just walk by and ignore it. Find out their story, find out their background, and do something. We're not asking you to build a house for this person or do whatever, buy a new car for this person. We're just asking, do something nice. Do they need a lift? Do you need a hand to change that tyre? Do you want me and my boys to run out here and give you a hand moving that dirt? Or whatever it might be. It might be simple things that we do for each other, white or black, or whatever background we are. So I hope this gives you a little bit more understanding. You'll do your research about other impacts, ongoing impacts of that. And, these videos are very, very sad for our people. They're very triggering for our people, but our stories and our truth needs to be told, that we were treated differently and we continue to be treated differently simply because we are who we are, we identify as who we are. And it's sad to think that the other part of those negative impacts is it's made our people feel ashamed to be Aboriginal, ashamed to be Torres Strait Islander, ashamed to be whatever. I can't tell you the amount of people where they found out that they have Aboriginal heritage and they're freaked out about it. No, we weren't Aboriginal. No, there's no way. Like it's a really bad thing. And yet some people do embrace, like, oh my God, now I understand why I was drawn to the culture or drawn to this person or whatever it is. But there is a population that, because of history and what they've learned, is it's a bad thing. Aboriginal people are the, lower than of the lowest. And that's just ignorance, and that's just racism, and that's just negative behaviour. So I hope you got something a little bit out of this episode today. And remember, see life in, through two-eye seeing. You threw it through your lens and you see it through someone else's lens. And I can guarantee you're going to learn something. So see you next time. Bye.